Okay, second question from Discord this week. They say it's a question from the 8th round of book club that they did, which is awesome. They read a book called Deep Simplicity by John Gribben, not a book that I know, but I like the title, Deep Simplicity. Question is, if life did evolve on other planets, would bipedal eyes-forward structure be optimal on those planets? In general, would similar complex systems find similar solutions? And this is a topic about which both you and I could go on about for a very long time. And we've answered some version of this question before. Let me make a first stab. I'll go back and forth a few times. You asked specifically, the Discord server asked specifically about both bipedal and eyes forward structure, which is just, it's called frontation, when your eyes are both on the same plane, basically, on the surface of your head, such that you can triangulate and get binocular vision as opposed to having a greater field of vision, but it's harder to perceive depth because for each of your eyes, you only have one eye on any particular prize that you're looking at. Whereas we have a lot behind our heads that we can't see, but what we can see is almost entirely perceivable with both of our eyes. Thus, we can track about how far it is and get a much better sense of position and speed as well. So would that, if we start from if eyes, would frontation, to say the idea to have binocular vision, be something that evolved in some organisms? Yes. But, if eyes, are photons going to be useful to sense your surrounding environment? Almost certainly. Could life evolve in a situation of total darkness in which there are other ways to sense things? I guess maybe. We don't know what that would look like. But so assuming a world in which you have, a non-tidally locked planet, and therefore there's night and day for everyone on the planet, and generally some organisms are optimized for dark, some for night, very occasionally for crepuscular, the dawn and dusk times. Those organisms that need to perceive distance quickly, which is to say often predators of other organisms that move around, will tend to end up having eyes forward facing. Bipedality is a bigger question because whereas photons are likely to be in abundance and free on just about any planet on which life can evolve, the advantage of bipedality are much more specific to the situation that we find ourselves in on this particular planet, with our particular history of being first sea-dwelling, then land-dwelling, then tree-dwelling primates, and then came back down to the land. So we're secondarily terrestrial, but we only emerged from the sea once. But we went up. Our primate ancestors were all arboreal. So we came down, and then some of our ancestors, presumably having come down, were still moving around on all fours, and then at some point we start to emerge. We start to emerge as bipedal organisms. Why? So is it so that we can carry things? Is it so that we can see higher over the grassland savannas in which we were mostly coming out of the trees and the forests into? Is it so? Those are two of the main hypotheses for why we ended up going bipedal, and there were of course a number of other associated changes with the bipedal gait. Bipedality seems particular enough that it's not at all clear to me that another origin of even sentient, highly sentient conscious life would inherently be bipedal on a different planet with different considerations. That's a first pass.
Yeah, I would answer this similarly, I think. Photons are free in most of the circumstances that we would expect to see life, not all of them. I think it's perfectly plausible that you could evolve in a dark situation and use something else, but I would expect the way I would do this is I would say, don't imagine some other place. Imagine that there are millions or billions of other places where life has evolved. Would we see bipedality? Often.
Right.
Would we see it more than half the time? Maybe not. Not in sentient creatures, but we have multiple bipedal terrestrial creatures, right?
The birds.
We've got the birds. We've
That's
got
one origin.
macropods.
kangaroos
kangaroos
and
and
wallabies.
wallabies.
Yeah.
Yep. So the point is bipedality works in certain creatures. We have kangaroo rats. We've got,
They're sort of facultatively bipedal. Right?
yeah, but my point is it shows up, and you have intermediates, lagomorphs, rabbits.
But in all those cases, it's from a quadrupedal source.
Yeah.
Right. So you've got in the biped and the bipedal organisms that you've just named, they're all tetrapods. They've all emerged from a deuterostome ancestor, which are bilaterally symmetrical. We have a left and a right. We mostly neatly, you can draw a line, an axis down our middle and fold us in half, and we're more or less.
Please don't.
Don't try this at home or anywhere else, actually, unless you're a mortician, in which case I guess you're allowed to, but probably not. But I actually wrote about this in the Sea Stars piece. Their thing, echinoderms, is radial symmetry. And our thing is bilateral symmetry. And bilateral symmetry is, of course, not just a thing of chordates, which is vertebrates plus a few other little things like tunicates. Insects have bilateral symmetry, but cephalopods, squid, and octopuses don't have bilateral symmetry, and they're plenty smart. They're plenty sentient. So bipedality.
Wait.
What?
I'm struggling over cephalopods not having bilateral symmetry.
I'm not actually positive.
They do.
Ammonites don't.
They do. All right, we're going to wrestle this to a proper conclusion at some point offline, and maybe return to it. But
the question doesn't ask about, what would be optimal. Also, is a little bit of a problem. Like, what is optimal on the planet? There's no answer to that. Are we the optimal form on this planet? Well, we have become the dominant form on this planet, but that doesn't mean that our form is what allowed us to become the dominant species on the planet, right?
There are components of it, and this comes up in your discussion of bipedality, right? We're always looking for some answer like, stood up to carry things or whatever. But
I didn't mention a third really stupid hypothesis the anthropologists have.
Oh, good.
Yeah. We went bipedal so that our backs didn't get sunburned.
Really?
Because we'd lost our hair.
Okay.
Yeah, I've had an anthropologist, and you might be able to imagine which one, argue that in front of a class to me.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I would say there's another possibility that's a little bit harder to wrestle to a testable question. But that is, in order to become what we were, our manual dexterity had to become much greater. That becomes possible at the point you're not walking on your hands. And so is there some interplay between, the fact is...
It's a specialization move.
Yeah.
So we, as bipeds, don't have opposable toes.
Right.
All the other primates have opposable toes. Their 4 hands and feet are much more equivalent to one another.
Yeah, they're similar while not being identical,
Right, they're not
or
identical,
not even close.
But they do they can do a lot more with their feet than we can do with our feet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so in any case, I don't, toothed whales are very intelligent. It's hard to imagine them ever doing to a globe what we've done to it, because they, in order to have flippers, do not have the dexterity. Their fingers aren't separate, which means that their ability to manipulate the world, to test hypotheses, things like that, is reduced. Their ability to produce tech, the path to a whale having the capacity to do these things, even if it had the intelligence that would set it on that path, is a much more difficult road. So,
and I think it's Shark Bay in Australia. Some of the dolphins, which are toothed whales, have adopted, I'm not sure it's Shark Bay, but somewhere, have adopted the habit of mounting sponges to their noses so that when they hunt sea urchins, they don't get jabbed by the urchin poison.
Interesting, because I thought that the explanation was the same one that has people putting lampshades on their heads at parties, which I'm not
also
sure.
Drunk, yes.
Right.
Yes.
But that presumably has very little to do with sea urchins.
Probably, unless the sea urchin said something, mean to them, and they're just drinking their sorrows away.
Oh, I suppose that's not very likely, but leave it in the realm of the possible. But in any case, if you imagine millions of planets with life that reaches sentience, which is certainly I think many of our expectation about a universe this large is that it would contain millions.
Yes.
Millions is even a low number for living planets that would have attained sentience or will. But would you find bipedality on many of them? I feel certain you would find it on many of them, many of the creatures.
You mean among the sentient beings?
Mm-hmm. I think it would be a frequent thing. I think visual orientation.
But I think that begins, again, from the quadrupedal expectation, right? So if the progression that we have here, life originates in the sea. Life emerges from the sea a few times. In our lineage, it emerges in a vertebrate form with a single brain with a single line of central nervous system down the back and bilateral symmetry, such that upon coming out, you have to deal with all the new things associated with gravity and different refractive indices of air versus water, all of this. And that, if that's what you're doing, if you've got like a quadrupedal form that is also, in the case of Earth, a tetrapod that has emerged onto land, and that's the lineage that becomes sentient on another planet, would bipedality end up being the sentient form in many of them? Yeah, but why not radial symmetry as the thing that becomes sentient? Why not aquatic creatures being the thing that becomes sentient? And in neither of those cases do you expect bipedality to be the form that the sentient beings adopt.
Well, my guess is there's a kind of very weak anthropic principle that we can use here, right? The fact that a bipedal, visually oriented creature attains sentience enough to travel into space means that is at least one valid path there. Could a radially symmetrical creature travel such a path? Maybe, but what if it's 500 times more difficult, right? Then the point is you would see it occasionally, but you wouldn't see it very regularly. You'd be much more likely, especially if you effectively have, you have selection, exploring, design space.
Right.
A quadrupedal platform is not the only platform that can explore design space in the way that the tetrapods have, but it is a very effective and repurposable platform. So you would expect to see many such explorations. And the question is, would you expect to see in such an exploration a bipedal lineage be more likely to attain technological capacity? I think so.
So I don't know that you would. And I guess I feel like the anthropic principle makes a probabilistic error then. That, this is the one we've got, therefore this is the one that is more likely. So it feels to me like just as in the tetrapod lineage, you have invertebrates, you have sort of a relatively early split after the origin of bone into ray fin fishes and lobe fin fishes. And the lobe fin fishes, which includes coelacanths and lungfish and all of the tetrapods, you have over time a reduction of the number of digits. And so some extant, that is to say still living on the planet, members of that clade have like 8 digits. And then we get a reduction and, you get to like a horse with 1 remaining digit, right? So there is, of course, room to say, okay, well, how many things is the right number? And over in radial symmetry land, just in the example that we happen to know, because this is where we live, among the sea stars, among the starfish, you have number of arms ranging from 5 to 50. So that same kind of developmental plasticity, well, in the case of sea stars, it seems to usually be species level differences, but to some degree developmental plasticity, it seems like that could be extraordinarily useful in a sentient organism to, if how many times have you wanted more than 2 of these to do what you're trying to do, and to be able to reach behind you and, in living in more spatial axes than we do live in.
Well, I want to take issue with one thing. It's probably it's too subtle to really pursue it, but the question of whether or not the anthropic principle applied to such a question is statistically invalid. Again, I said it's a very weak form because we could be a very unusual sentient creature. Right. That's always possible. You could be the only one that is bipedal in the whole universe, because it was a very difficult route and we took it, and we wouldn't know that because we haven't seen any other examples. However, let's say that an alien species had a transporter and it transported exactly one person at random off the Earth. Okay? What are the chances that that person has a height that is somewhere near the average? Pretty high. What is the chances that that person's height is exactly average? 0. So there is a weak ability to infer, a weak but not non-existent ability.
It's not 0.
No, the chances that their height is exactly equal actually is 0. Nobody's height is exactly.
That's not what I was responding to. That's not what you said.
But
the chances that what we look like looks like nothing else in the universe are low, but not 0.
Right, not 0. Yeah, sorry, I thought you were responding to a different point. Chances are not 0, and if you picked one person at random, although they would be average in exactly no way, there's probably not a single characteristic that they're truly indistinguishable from the average. But the chances that you would, you'd be 50-50 on sex, right? There is no average sex. There are 2 sexes, so you'd have information on one and not the other. You might be able to infer the other. But in every other regard, you would have information of a noisy kind about intelligence. What if you selected somebody at random who was severely mentally disabled, right? You happen to pick a person that, in cognitive failure at the end of their life. Not representative. But the chances that you would reach such a person are low. So anyway, there'd be a smattering.
I'm not sure what we're setting up here. I'm not sure what I'm going to end up having to respond to.
My point is, the individual as representative of the species is not a different puzzle than our version of sentience evolving in a...
I don't agree with that. I don't think that it's 0, because the universe does have some universal laws, right? But even, and I would have to go back and look at the research I was doing when I was working on science fiction, but, even the type of star that the planet that the life has evolved in is around, and therefore the frequencies, the abundance, the temperature range, is it carbon-based life, right? Or is it silicon-based life? Like there are just so many things that render life here versus life elsewhere in the universe much more different, potentially, than one individual versus another individual from the same species on the same instantiation of the evolution of sentient life on this planet.
No, I think that is actually looking at it the wrong way.
Okay, how?
Because, yes, there are many differences. Could be carbon, could be silicon. Don't know which one would be more common, but it's not an infinite diversity on which you could build a platform of life that would look like Earth life. So the ability to work backwards...
Well, why does it have to look like Earth life?
It doesn't. But
this is like, so if we're constrained to it looks like Earth life, then that seems like a cheat.
No. Is it possible to have life in a state of plasma, right, where you do not have elements having coalesced, for example? Probably not. Am I ruling it out? Do I think I know enough? No, but my point is, we do know that you can get life in a universe that is, rich with chemical elements and sufficiently cool and all of that. We know you can get it on a planet that isn't tidally locked. We don't know for sure what happens if you bake the hell out of one side of a planet and leave the other in total darkness. That's an interesting thought experiment, but we do know that on a planet that rotates and provides a balance, you do get certain forms evolving. So anyway, all I'm saying is that the amount of information that a single individual provides about the species Homo sapiens is considerable, but you could imagine many places where extrapolating from a single individual would lead you into a cul-de-sac. So it's low quality information, but it's significant information. I'm inferring that in a universe full of different evolutions of life, in which some of those evolutions produce something sentient, that a single individual has the same characteristic. An evolution of life.
What characteristic?
That it tells you some things about how life evolved.
Oh, the same. So a single individual from a species of sentient life on some other planet should similarly provide an indication, albeit imperfect, of what the whole species is like.
Right. And the way that is most useful is that we can say, what are the chances that we are an average platform for sentience? Substantial.
But to me, that's a leap there. So individuals representing species imperfectly, yes. Here, elsewhere, yes. Therefore, an example here you can use to infer what it likely looks like there, I am not as compelled by.
Well, again, I'm projecting onto a universe of examples that we will never see.
Yeah, unfortunately.
No, I don't think unfortunately. The question is...
You don't want to see them?
No. Oh, yes. I very much want to see them immediately if possible. And I have questions for them.
So hopefully do they?
Hopefully. And no doubt they would. But my only point is the chances that our path to sentience was particularly convoluted are low. The chances that it's something like the average path is relatively high. I
guess I just don't. There's so many steps. I mean, you know this
right,
as well as anyone. So, if every step there were 1,000 possibilities, and 500 of those are kind of near the middle, and let's just even if it's just 100 that are like more likely than not, and every single time we went with one of those middle 100, that's still so like you take that one or that one, and now you're like you just go so far
again.
Apart so
I think the logic is incorrect worked this way, and I get it, right?
So I have not yet heard the counter argument.
Okay, can we rule out sentient plants?
No,
we can't.
No.
Am I expecting them?
No.
No, I'm really not expecting.
No, I'm so disappointed in this question.
Right. Well, I know, but my point is it safe to rule out sentient plants?
No.
Nope. On the other hand, would I be right to be surprised as I ran into them elsewhere in the universe? I would be right to be surprised because there are logical reasons to say that actually was a branch not particularly likely to generate sentience.
But the original question, which also incidentally didn't talk about sentience, but like we've moved into a sentience question, specifically mentions two characteristics: frontation, like binocular vision, and bipedality.
Yep.
And in my initial foray into answering it, I did separate those and said, well, given, yes, it's possible. It could be deep sea. It could be tidally locked. It could whatever. Maybe no photons, but given the ubiquity and freeness of photons, probably photons, in which case frontation, yes, almost, very, very often. I won't say almost certainly, but very often. Whereas bipedality has a lot more contingencies that happen before you end up having that be a useful form.
Yep. I agree. I agree with your hierarchy, right? I think.
And this is like, this is one of the things that I used to do in my vertebrate evolution program. It's like my final big, it's like, okay, I've got 12 characteristics that have evolved on this planet. In a rerun from history, we're starting at 500 million years ago. I want you to you tell me, and use everything at your disposal to argue your case, which one of these things, like the likelihood that each one of these things would actually re-evolve in a rerunning of history from a starting point 500 million years ago, like base vertebrate.
Right.
And it included everything from lungs and feathers to written language. Written language is an easy one. It's always last, right? And on this list. But, how do you prioritize things that in this running of history are contingent on one another, right? But aren't necessarily contingent on one another, and it could have easily happened separately. I think it's a super fun game, but I don't think, given that there is a difference, even just between like binocular vision, frontation, and bipedality, I can't imagine why we imagine that the sentient aliens out there, on average, kind of look like us.
Well, I'm not saying that they do. I'm saying that you can infer something about the potential of different pathways, and that
Okay.
the ability to, for you and me to look at things like plants and say, we don't really expect highly mobile photosynthetic animals because it doesn't work. And we don't really expect plants to develop sentience because it doesn't pay.
Yeah. What's
know,
it doing for them?
right.
What problem is it solving?
And if I did that over 1,000 different questions, would I expect to be wrong some fraction of the time? Yes, but I would expect to be well above random at the ability to say that's going to, birds are going to have despite bipedality, birds are going to have a hard time developing technology because their wings don't lend themselves to become very dexterous in the manipulation of objects like flippers.
Right, but on a different planet, perhaps the early equivalent of land vertebrates have 3 pairs of legs instead of 2, and then they get to be the
Right.
angels, right?
Sure.
Which have somehow 3 pairs of appendages, arms and wings and legs, right? So maybe on a different planet,
Yeah.
birds do become the tool users because they're actually working with an additional set of limbs.
That is well within the realm of possibility.
There's nothing in anything that I have imagined that says, oh well, that wouldn't happen. Like, why not? Why 2 sets instead of 3?
No, I'm not
Insects
saying,
are doing it.
I don't necessarily see any reason to expect 2 sets versus 3, because for one thing, we've seen an even more successful radiation that has 3 sets. So we know that radiations with 3 sets can explore a large amount of design space, and it just so happens to be arthropods who had some other pieces of the deck stacked against their sentience, exoskeletons and things that probably do not properly fit with extremely long lifespans and things like that.
I wonder about complete metamorphosis as well. I wonder if a complete reconfiguring of all of your body tissues as you become an adult doesn't effectively limit the value of a long childhood.
Yeah, it means that the developmental pattern is unlikely to discover something in which you have a second pattern, a second mode of inheritance, things like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just don't think that. As somebody who's spent a lot of time thinking about design space and how selection explores it, it's an impossibly complex puzzle that is much less complex than a completely free canvas. And
it's not a completely free canvas, but I'm not. I think we have both thought about things related to this from actually surprisingly different viewpoints, from standing in different places, and I am not compelled by what I hear as your argument that because each of these decisions, each of these things that ended up evolving happened here, and there were reasons that they did, and that the other choices the wrong language here, but the other things that evolved have long since disappeared. That is very particular, as you know, not just to the particular space and time in which it happened, but the long history on which it was building, and just the number of lungs seem inevitable. In our running of history, lungs evolved. Lungs evolved and were kind of in use before the thing that for a long time we thought they evolved from, the swim bladders of ray-finned fishes. Like, it looks to us like, well, they've been in the water forever, and so we must have just co-opted that. It's like, no, somehow there were lungs already like nascent in these water-breathing, gill-having organisms. Super surprising. We don't, as far as I know, I haven't looked at the literature in a few years, but we don't really have a good idea of what that was about, like why that was there, why that was retained for a long time without having obvious functionality, and then sort of bursts into 2 very different things that are homologous with one another, that are like the same organ but doing very different doing very different functions on land and water. Given how many of those stories we know about this planet, there have to be just as many stories on any other planet where complex life has evolved.
Believe me, I have no doubt that every evolution of life would be completely surprising, one thing after another, but there would also be many, many patterns which you would get used to seeing repeatedly. And I would just point to another example. I want to put a principle on the table here. The principle is that once you have some clade of creatures exploring design space with some adaptation, that it reduces the chances of a second clade discovering that thing, because that second clade will have a very hard time competing with the first clade that has an advantage.
But not between planets.
No, I'm not there yet. My point would be, let's take image-forming eyes, of which we have 3 examples on Earth, right? We have the vertebrate example, we have the cephalopod example, and we have the insect example.
Are you sure that cephalopods and...
Yeah.
Separate evolutions?
Separate evolutions. Yep. 3 image-forming eyes, which function very much similarly, we now understand. There are some advantages to the cephalopod eye. The vertebrate eye is inverted and has a blind spot that is a defect. But nonetheless, the point is, how the thing works is shockingly similar, in spite of the fact that you had clearly 2 of those 3 being explored by adaptive evolution in a world that already had 1. So my point is, image-forming eyes are so useful.
But it had 1, but that one wasn't available. Like the early vertebrates didn't have access to a cephalopod eye.
Right, and the question is, why in that world were there niches sufficiently different that the fact that some clade was already exploring with image-forming eyes did not mean that it was simply going to outcompete any vertebrate ancestor that developed an eye, for example. So anyway, my point is, the fact of selection repeating itself with both convergent evolution and parallelisms is such a common pattern and happens with such regularity and surprising convergence on detail that it speaks to a constrained design space.
Okay, I think I know where we're disagreeing then.
Okay.
Because on eyes and even on frontation, which is a more precise version of eyes and what you can do with them, I think we're in agreement. It's fascinating that they picked these 2 examples for this question, right? With regard to bipedality, the utility of bipedality is so contingent, not just on the landscape in which you move, but also the bow plan on which you are evolving from, the bow plan from which you are evolving. And there are a number of bow plans that organisms can evolve from that are highly functional and that could still allow them to manipulate tools and be social and all of these things. And there are also a lot of media in which sentient organisms might be moving around their landscape where bipedality would not necessarily be the right thing. So you and I do not disagree about the power of convergence, the power of selection, the power of convergence. I think we are disagreeing at actually a fairly trivial level about, because the part of this that I've spent a very lot of time thinking about is what kinds of things would actually always happen every single time, and therefore you have to put them right up at the top of the list, even if they don't seem important to you.
Yep.
Because they would just always happen no matter what.
Yep.
Now, in my, in the exam, this take-home exam that I would always give to my students, it was a rerunning of life on Earth.
Yeah.
And so I do think that things are potentially quite different on other planets. But there are other things that wouldn't necessarily evolve. And so, to some degree, this may be uninteresting to us, but seem really interesting to other people. Where if I say, well, feathers might not evolve, yeah, but flight will. Flight will evolve, right? You know, in on a planet with an atmosphere where life is evolving, where where therefore there was enough like resistance in the air that flight could work.
Yeah.
Flight will evolve, but it isn't necessarily with something that we might recognize as feathers, right?
Right. Oh yeah, totally agree, and I totally agree that the frontation of the eyes is much more likely to be seen as a regular pattern among sentient creatures than bipedality. Bipedality seems much more arbitrary, and in fact, bipedality is kind of a bad bow plan as it is, right?
Yeah, we're not doing it very well.
It's
birds are rocking it better than we are.
It's fraught with hazards. And so it may be that that's actually a hint about what it is, that what else we were, our dexterity with our hands was worth the cost of becoming a quadruped that stood up on two legs and dealt with the problem.
Well, at least our backs aren't burned. I mean, we do have that going for us.
Right. Anyway, I think we've got.
Navigating through shallow waters is another thing that's been posed for. So like aquatic ape. The smart version of the aquatic ape hypothesis for why we went bipedal. That you have, for instance, baboons in the Okavango Delta in Botswana, sometimes actually with babies on their tummies as the mothers swim between islands during the flooded season. Actually, the babies will drown. Like, it's crazy. But this is Cheney and Seyfarth doing their amazing work, who've reported like they actually do this. Like somehow they forget that the baby can't breathe when it's underwater. So, walking upright allows you to go through deeper water and potentially not drown your baby, for instance. All right, that was fun.
Yeah. All right.